Burkina Faso stands at the crossroads of history. The world watches as one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, faces the power of global giants. Accused of hoarding his nation's wealth, the pressure is on, but Burkina Faso will not surrender. What happens when an African leader refuses to be controlled by foreign interests? The answer: a revolution. A fight for sovereignty. A fight for dignity. This is more than politics, this is the battle for Africa's future. Burkina Faso has found itself in the midst of a global firestorm as accusations and diplomatic tensions rise. At the heart of this conflict is one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. A figure who, in just 2 years, has transformed from a military leader to a symbol of defiance against Western powers. The narrative surrounding Burkina Faso has shifted dramatically, and it all began with a simple question: who controls Burkina Faso's resources? The accusations were sparked by U.S. Army General Michael Langley, who publicly accused Captain Ibrahim Traoré of hoarding the country's vast natural wealth, particularly its gold reserves, for himself and his allies. These claims didn't just target Traoré, they targeted the very essence of sovereignty. It's not the first time a strong African leader has been accused of corruption when they refuse to bow down to foreign interests. Africa has long been the battleground of foreign powers, eager to seize the continent's resources while leaving its people in poverty. But this time, it's different. This time, the accusation of corruption is not just about the wealth, it's about control. Langley's remarks were not simply accusations, they were part of a larger narrative that seeks to undermine African leaders who dare to challenge the status quo. But for many Africans, Langley's words were not just an attack on one leader, they were an attack on Africa's dignity. The backlash from African citizens and commentators alike was swift and intense. Across social media, people voiced their anger, questioning why African leaders are so often demonized when they stand up for their countries. For too long, Africa's resources have been plundered by foreign powers, and when an African leader like Ibrahim Traoré refuses to let that happen, he's labeled corrupt, dangerous, and a threat to his own people. But to the people of Burkina Faso, Traoré is a hero. He has refused to sell out his country, choosing instead to take a stand for sovereignty and self-determination. His decision to reject foreign influence has sparked a movement across Africa. It's not just about Burkina Faso, it's about the entire continent taking back its resources and its future. In a powerful televised address, Captain Ibrahim Traoré responded directly to General Langley's accusations. His words were calm, but they were piercing. He dismissed the claims as lies and made it clear that Burkina Faso would not bow to foreign pressure. His message was clear: Burkina Faso would not surrender its sovereignty. Traoré's words were not just a rebuttal, they were a rallying cry for Africans everywhere. He reminded his people that this fight was not just about one man or one country, it was about Africa's future. Either we fight for our freedom, or we remain slaves forever, Traoré said, a statement that reverberated across the continent. His call for unity and resistance against manipulation struck a chord with many. Across the Sahel and beyond, Africans began to see Burkina Faso as a beacon of hope, a country standing firm against the tide of colonial influence. Traoré's words were not just about resistance, they were about reclaiming Africa's power, pride, and future. His refusal to let foreign powers control Burkina Faso's resources became a symbol of the continent's fight for independence. And as the accusations against him continued to grow, so did the support for his leadership. But the battle was not without its challenges. Traoré's rise to power has made him a target. There are rumors of assassination attempts, foreign-backed rebellions, and a growing network of external forces working to destabilize the country. But despite these threats, Traoré has remained resolute. His leadership is not just about Burkina Faso's sovereignty, it's about the future of Africa itself. What happens in Burkina Faso could change the entire continent's destiny. As the situation unfolds, many are asking the question: will Africa allow its leaders to stand for their people, or will they continue to be pawns in a game of global power politics? In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré is showing the world that Africa's time has come. But the question remains, will the world allow it? The global reaction to Captain Ibrahim Traoré's defiant stance has been mixed, but for many in Africa, it represents a turning point. For years, African nations have been struggling against foreign powers that seek to exploit their resources while keeping their people in poverty. Traoré's refusal to bow to Western pressure is seen as an act of resistance, one that challenges the narrative that African countries must submit to the will of foreign powers to succeed. The French government, in particular, has found itself on the defensive. Once a key ally of Burkina Faso, France's relationship with the country has deteriorated sharply since Traoré's rise to power. The French government, long seen as a colonial power with interests in Africa's resources, now faces the consequences of Burkina Faso's rejection of its influence. For many in the French government, the situation in Burkina Faso is more than just a political issue, it's a challenge to their decades-long hold over Africa's resources. The accusations of corruption and hoarding are, in many ways, a defense mechanism. By painting Traoré as a corrupt leader, France hopes to undermine his credibility and destabilize the movement he represents. But these tactics are no longer as effective as they once were. Social media and international media have given the African people a platform to voice their concerns and challenge the narratives pushed by foreign powers. Traoré's story, and the story of Burkina Faso's resistance, is being shared around the world. The French government's response has been to double down on its criticisms of Traoré, accusing him of destabilizing the region and warning that his rise to power could lead to chaos in the Sahel. But these threats have not deterred the people of Burkina Faso. In fact, they have only strengthened their resolve. Every attack on Traoré, every accusation made by foreign governments, serves as a reminder of the struggle for Africa's freedom. The movement for sovereignty, led by Traoré, is not just about one country's future, it's about the future of the entire continent. Africa's history has been shaped by the exploitation of its people and resources by foreign powers. For centuries, European nations, including France, have controlled much of Africa's wealth, leaving the people in poverty while reaping the rewards of their natural resources. This exploitation is not just a thing of the past, it continues to this day. But the rise of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré signals that Africa is beginning to change. The people of Burkina Faso are no longer willing to accept a system that prioritizes foreign interests over their own. And they are not alone. Across the Sahel, in Mali, Niger, and other countries, leaders are rising who are determined to challenge the status quo. These leaders, like Traoré, are calling for African unity, self-sufficiency, and the reclaiming of the continent's resources. They are calling for Africa to take control of its future, without the interference of foreign powers. This shift in mindset is sending shockwaves throughout the Western world. For decades, African nations have been told that their development depends on foreign aid and foreign investment. They have been told that they cannot succeed without the support of Western powers. But the story of Burkina Faso, and the rise of Traoré, challenges this narrative. The country has shown that it is possible to achieve sovereignty and self-determination, even in the face of intense pressure from foreign powers. However, the road ahead for Burkina Faso is not without challenges. The regime's response to the protests has been violent and oppressive, and the threat of further instability looms large. Traoré's government faces pressure not just from foreign powers, but also from within. Political opponents, rival factions, and armed groups are all vying for control, and the security situation in the country remains tense. The risk of escalation into a full-scale conflict is real. But Traoré's leadership has united the people in ways that few expected. His message of resistance, of reclaiming Africa's resources and destiny, has resonated deeply with the Burkinabe people. They are no longer passive victims of foreign exploitation, they are active participants in the fight for their future. As the struggle continues, Burkina Faso's example will likely inspire other nations across Africa to take similar stands. This is not just a fight for Burkina Faso's future, it is a fight for Africa's future. The continent has been held back by external powers for far too long, and now, the tide is beginning to turn. The people of Burkina Faso have shown that they are willing to fight for their freedom and sovereignty, no matter the cost. The question now is whether they can overcome the forces that seek to destroy their movement. Will the people of Burkina Faso succeed in reclaiming their future, or will the international community's pressure force them back into submission? The stakes are high, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire African continent. The world is watching as this revolution unfolds, and its outcome will shape the future of Africa for generations to come. This is just the beginning, and the world is witnessing history in the making. As the situation in Burkina Faso continued to unfold, the world watched with bated breath. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's rise to power had shaken not just the country, but the entire region. What had begun as a military coup had turned into a full-scale revolution, a fight for the very future of Burkina Faso, and a challenge to the West's long-standing influence in Africa. While foreign powers had initially condemned the coup, accusing Traoré of destabilizing the region, the reality on the ground was far more complex. Burkina Faso was no longer content to be a pawn in the game of international politics. The people, led by Traoré, had taken matters into their own hands, and they were determined to change the course of their nation's history. But the stakes were higher than just one country's future. The revolution in Burkina Faso had become a symbol of resistance for the entire African continent. For decades, Africa had been exploited by foreign powers, with its natural resources stripped away and its people left in poverty. The rise of leaders like Ibrahim Traoré represented a shift, a refusal to accept the status quo, a rejection of the idea that African nations had to rely on foreign aid and foreign investment to survive. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was not just about overthrowing a government, it was about reclaiming their future. Traoré had made it clear that he would not back down in the face of international pressure. He had rejected foreign influence and had taken a stand for Burkina Faso's sovereignty. His message was clear: Burkina Faso would no longer be a puppet state controlled by external powers. But with this bold stand came significant risks. The international community was not going to let go of its influence over Burkina Faso so easily. As the revolution gained momentum, so did the efforts of foreign powers to destabilize the country. The economic sanctions began to mount, and Western-backed opposition groups began to rise in the country. The government, however, stood firm, with Traoré at the helm, refusing to be cowed by the pressures of foreign interference. On the streets of the capital, Lomé, the protests continued. The people were no longer just protesting a government, they were protesting the entire system. The protests had grown from an expression of political discontent into a broader movement for African sovereignty. People were no longer satisfied with the idea of being subjugated by foreign powers. They wanted independence, true independence. The global reaction to Burkina Faso's revolution was mixed. While many African countries expressed solidarity with the people of Burkina Faso, the West remained largely silent. France, a longtime ally of Burkina Faso, was particularly vocal in its criticism of Traoré's leadership. But this silence from the West was telling. It highlighted the unwillingness of foreign powers to accept that Africa might no longer need them. The Western powers had been so entrenched in Africa for so long that the idea of a country like Burkina Faso rejecting their influence was almost unthinkable. And yet, here it was, happening in real time. Traoré's defiance was not just about politics, it was about pride. For far too long, African nations had been told they could not survive without the West's help. But Burkina Faso was proving that, with the right leadership, it was possible to stand up to the world's most powerful nations. The battle was far from over, and the outcome was uncertain. But one thing was clear: the people of Burkina Faso were willing to fight for their freedom, and they were not afraid to take on the world. The international community had underestimated the resolve of the African people. Burkina Faso's revolution was about more than just one man or one country, it was about the entire continent's fight for self-determination. The revolution had sparked a fire that could not be extinguished. As the situation in Burkina Faso continued to evolve, many were asking the question, could this revolution inspire other African nations to take similar stands for their sovereignty? If Burkina Faso could stand up to foreign powers, could other nations do the same? The implications of this revolution stretched far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. The entire continent was watching, and the stakes had never been higher. As the days went on, it became clear that Burkina Faso's fight was not just about political change, it was about changing the very nature of Africa's relationship with the world. The people of Burkina Faso had already won one battle. They had rejected foreign control over their resources, and they had shown that they would no longer be subjugated. But the next battle would be even more difficult. The Western powers, though silent for now, would not give up easily. They would continue to exert pressure on Burkina Faso, hoping to bring the revolution to an end. But Traoré and the people of Burkina Faso were ready. They had come too far to turn back now. The revolution had become more than just a fight for one country, it had become a symbol of the fight for Africa's freedom. And the question that now hung in the air was this: would Africa rise together, or would it continue to be controlled by the same powers that had held it down for centuries? As the international pressure mounted, Burkina Faso stood firm, its leaders and citizens determined to protect their hard-earned sovereignty. The West had underestimated the power of an entire nation rising in defiance of its past. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the face of this movement, became a symbol not only for Burkina Faso but for Africa as a whole. His unwavering stance against foreign interference resonated deeply across the continent, creating a ripple effect that reached the farthest corners of Africa. The people of Burkina Faso had made it clear, this wasn't just about political change. This was a revolution that transcended national borders. It was about breaking the chains of historical exploitation that had held Africa captive for centuries. It was about African leaders rising up and taking control of their own destinies. But the battle was far from over. The government of Burkina Faso found itself facing not only external pressure but also internal challenges. Political divisions, rival factions, and rising security threats from various rebel groups began to complicate the situation. Despite the popular support for Traoré's leadership, the realities of governance in a country so divided were beginning to take their toll. The government had to navigate the delicate balance between maintaining the unity of the revolution and dealing with the many challenges that came with establishing a new political order. The situation became even more complicated as Burkina Faso's economy began to feel the impact of the ongoing unrest. The nation's resources were under strain as sanctions from Western countries began to take their toll. Key industries, particularly gold mining, faced disruption, and the global market reacted to the uncertainty in the country. But despite these challenges, the people remained resilient. Traoré's call for unity and self-sufficiency continued to inspire the masses. For the first time in years, Burkina Faso had the opportunity to build an economy based on its own resources, without relying on foreign powers. The gold mines, the country's most valuable asset, were now under the control of the people. The revolution had given the nation the opportunity to turn its resources into wealth for the people, rather than allowing foreign companies to reap the benefits. But this was just the beginning. The people knew that their struggle was not just about securing their wealth, it was about ensuring that their resources were used to benefit all of Burkina Faso's citizens. The fight for sovereignty, self-determination, and economic independence was far from over. As the months passed, the situation in Burkina Faso became increasingly complex. While Traoré's leadership remained strong, the country's internal divisions began to widen. Opposition factions, both inside the government and in the military, began to question the direction of the revolution. Some of these factions were wary of the growing influence of foreign-backed groups, while others were concerned about the stability of the country in the face of rising internal unrest. The external threats were also growing. Rebel groups backed by foreign powers began to infiltrate the country, fueling further instability. The government, under Traoré's leadership, found itself engaged in a delicate struggle, not just with foreign powers, but also with its own citizens, who were demanding more from the revolution. But Traoré remained resolute. His message was clear: the revolution was not just about one man, one group, or one government. It was about the people of Burkina Faso. And the people, he believed, would not be swayed by foreign powers or internal division. They had a vision for their future, and they were willing to fight for it. Meanwhile, across Africa, other nations watched as Burkina Faso's revolution unfolded. The message was clear: Africa's time had come. The struggle for sovereignty in Burkina Faso was not an isolated event, it was part of a larger movement sweeping across the continent. In Mali, Niger, and beyond, leaders were rising up and demanding that their nations be allowed to chart their own course, free from the interference of former colonial powers and the influence of multinational corporations. These leaders understood that the future of Africa depended on self-sufficiency, resource management, and the ability to control their own destinies. The West, meanwhile, was forced to reconsider its approach to Africa. No longer could it take for granted its influence over the continent's wealth and resources. Burkina Faso's revolution was a reminder to the world that Africa could no longer be ignored. The revolution, led by Ibrahim Traoré, had sparked a fire that was spreading beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. It had become a symbol of hope for African nations that had long been subjected to foreign domination. But the question remained: would the revolution be able to overcome the internal divisions, foreign threats, and economic challenges that lay ahead? The world would soon find out. As the people of Burkina Faso continued their struggle for freedom and independence, the outcome of their revolution would determine not just their future, but the future of the entire continent. Could Burkina Faso's revolution lead the way for Africa's liberation? Or would it be crushed under the weight of external pressure and internal conflict? The answer to that question would shape the course of African history for generations to come. By the middle of July 2025, the revolution in Burkina Faso had evolved into an all-out struggle for the future of the nation. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the face of resistance, stood firm against mounting external and internal pressures, but the road ahead was fraught with challenges. The revolution was not just about confronting Western powers, it was about confronting a deeply entrenched political system that had plagued the country for decades. The Burkinabe people had risen against the Nazingbe dynasty, but as they did, they were faced with the reality of building a new future from the ashes of the old regime. Internally, divisions within the government and the military began to surface. The revolution had sparked a new wave of political activism and competition for power, and while Traoré's leadership remained largely unchallenged, the risk of fragmentation within the revolutionary movement was growing. Factions within the military, some loyal to the old regime, began to destabilize the fragile unity that had brought the revolution this far. In particular, various rebel groups, supported by foreign powers, began to infiltrate Burkina Faso's borders, further complicating the situation. These foreign-backed groups were intent on exploiting the instability, and their presence only added to the difficulty of maintaining control. While the people of Burkina Faso stood united in their call for freedom and sovereignty, the path to achieving these ideals was not a simple one. The political landscape was in flux, and with every passing day, the pressure on the government grew. To counter the increasing threats, Traoré turned to the people, mobilizing them in defense of their newfound sovereignty. His message of self-sufficiency and unity resonated deeply with the citizens, but as the stakes rose, so did the challenges. Foreign nations, particularly France, began to increase their efforts to undermine Burkina Faso's revolution. Economic sanctions were imposed, aiming to strangle the country's access to vital resources, including its most lucrative asset, gold. France, and other Western powers with vested interests in the region, had long relied on Burkina Faso's resources, and the sudden shift in power was not something they could afford to let slide. For the first time, the people of Burkina Faso were being forced to confront not just the reality of foreign interference, but also the weight of their own resources being used against them. The government's response was clear: Burkina Faso would not back down. Traoré's message remained steadfast: Africa had long been exploited by foreign powers, but no more. Burkina Faso would fight for its independence and control over its resources, no matter the cost. This fight was no longer about Burkina Faso alone, it was about the entire African continent. The struggle for Burkina Faso's future represented a much larger battle, one for Africa's autonomy and self-determination. As the revolution gained momentum, the voices of African leaders from across the continent began to amplify. They saw Burkina Faso's fight as their own and rallied behind Traoré's leadership, offering solidarity and support. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and other nations in the Sahel region took note of Burkina Faso's resistance, understanding that the outcome of this revolution could shape the future of the entire region. But despite the growing support, the revolution faced immense challenges. Burkina Faso's economy was under siege. Sanctions and foreign-backed rebel activity were taking their toll, and the government had to act swiftly to prevent the economy from spiraling out of control. Traoré's administration began to focus on strengthening the domestic economy, prioritizing self-reliance and sustainable growth. Agricultural reforms were enacted to reduce dependence on foreign imports, and efforts were made to diversify the economy by investing in sectors like education, infrastructure, and technology. However, these efforts were not without their challenges. With the country's resources being squeezed by both external and internal pressures, it was difficult to maintain the momentum of the revolution while also ensuring the survival of the country's economy. But the people of Burkina Faso had shown that they were willing to endure hardships for the sake of their future. As the revolution continued, Traoré's message remained clear: the people of Burkina Faso would not be slaves to foreign powers, nor would they allow their country's resources to be exploited by outside forces. But the international community's reaction remained one of uncertainty. Western powers, particularly France, had historically relied on African nations for resources, and the prospect of losing access to these resources was unacceptable. As the pressure on Burkina Faso intensified, the world began to question whether the revolution would succeed or fail. Could Burkina Faso's revolution overcome the combined forces of foreign powers and internal divisions? Would the peoples will be strong enough to push back against the external pressure and build a new future for their country? The stakes had never been higher. As the situation unfolded, one thing became abundantly clear: Burkina Faso's revolution was about more than just the future of the country, it was about the future of Africa itself. The outcome of this revolution would shape the trajectory of Africa's fight for self-determination and sovereignty in the 21st century. The world was watching, and the question on everyone's mind was whether the people of Burkina Faso could succeed in building a new future or whether they would be crushed under the weight of foreign powers and internal turmoil. Only time would tell. As Burkina Faso continued its struggle for sovereignty, the international community found itself divided. Western powers, including France, continued to exert significant pressure on Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government, seeking to destabilize the revolution through economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and covert operations. However, as the days passed, the revolution grew stronger, and the people of Burkina Faso remained resolute in their fight for independence. It became clear that this was not just a battle for the future of one country, but a fight for the broader future of Africa. Traoré's leadership was more than a symbol of resistance, it was a call to arms for African nations to take control of their own resources and their own destinies. The people of Burkina Faso had long been subjected to exploitation by foreign powers, their natural wealth extracted while they remained trapped in poverty. Now, under the banner of sovereignty and independence, the revolution had spread far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. Neighboring nations like Mali and Niger had begun to follow suit, drawing inspiration from Burkina Faso's defiance and Traoré's refusal to bow to foreign interests. What had started as a localized struggle against the Nazingbe dynasty had quickly become a larger movement for self-determination, solidarity, and the reclamation of Africa's wealth. But the battle was not without its challenges. The internal divisions within Burkina Faso's government were growing, with political factions beginning to push for a more moderate approach to governance. While the country's revolution was popular with the people, maintaining internal unity was becoming increasingly difficult as the pressure from both foreign and domestic forces mounted. As the military conflict continued and tensions within the country escalated, the government of Burkina Faso was forced to navigate a complex web of political, economic, and security challenges. The country's fragile infrastructure and economy were feeling the strain of the revolution, and the people were growing increasingly concerned about the future. The ongoing rebellion had led to disruptions in trade, cuts to essential services, and a severe decline in living standards. Traoré's leadership was being tested like never before. Yet, despite these challenges, the people of Burkina Faso remained united. The spirit of defiance that had ignited the revolution was stronger than ever. They were no longer simply protesting for change, they were fighting to ensure that their country could chart its own course, free from the dominance of foreign powers. The international community was watching closely as the revolution unfolded, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Could Burkina Faso overcome the pressure from external forces, internal divisions, and the growing economic strain? Would the people's determination be enough to secure the future they so desperately desired? Or would the weight of the revolution's challenges prove too much to bear? The world was on edge, and Burkina Faso's fate remained uncertain. Meanwhile, the leaders of France, the United States, and other Western nations were considering their next moves. The success of Burkina Faso's revolution posed a significant threat to the established international order. A successful African revolution would challenge the very foundations of the global power dynamics that had been built over the past century. For the first time in a long time, the people of an African nation were refusing to accept the status quo. As pressure mounted and the revolution continued, Africa's future hung in the balance. What happened in Burkina Faso would reverberate across the continent, and the implications for the global order were enormous. The world watched as the revolution unfolded, with millions of people asking the same question: could this be the moment when Africa finally broke free from the chains of colonialism, exploitation, and foreign dominance? The answer to that question would shape the future of Africa for generations to come. As the conflict raged on and the revolution intensified, Burkina Faso's people stood resolute, unwilling to accept anything less than complete independence and sovereignty. The fight for Africa's future was not just unfolding in the streets of Lomé, it was a fight for the soul of the continent. For Africa's leaders, the success of Burkina Faso's revolution represented a beacon of hope, a chance to reclaim their nation's future from foreign control. For the people of Burkina Faso, the revolution was more than a political struggle, it was the birth of a new Africa. But as the revolution progressed, it became clear that the world would not allow this change to happen without a fight. The international community, particularly Western powers, would stop at nothing to maintain their influence over Africa's resources and people. Would the revolution succeed? Would Burkina Faso and its people achieve the independence they sought, or would the forces of imperialism and exploitation crush their dreams? As the days turned into weeks and the revolution gathered momentum, the world held its breath. The question was no longer just about Burkina Faso's future, it was about Africa's future, and the people who were willing to fight for it. As the revolution in Burkina Faso progressed, it became evident that the people's determination was unwavering. The rise of Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not only a symbol of resistance against foreign influence but also a testament to the resilience of the Burkinabe people. The struggle, however, was far from simple. With foreign powers, led by France, intensifying their efforts to destabilize the nation, the pressure on the revolution grew. Economic sanctions and covert operations were carried out to undermine the momentum of the people's fight for sovereignty. Yet, the more the West intervened, the more the spirit of the Burkinabe people hardened. This wasn't just about overthrowing a political system, it was about reclaiming the nation's wealth, dignity, and self-determination. The international community's response was multifaceted. While the French government, along with some European powers, condemned the revolution and labeled Traoré a destabilizing force, many African nations watched closely. Burkina Faso's fight had become a beacon of hope for the entire continent, a symbol that African nations could rise above the influence of former colonial powers and control their own futures. The growing movement of solidarity from other African leaders gave the revolution added strength. Mali, Niger, and other nations in the Sahel region saw Burkina Faso's refusal to bow to foreign interests as a challenge to the long-standing exploitation of African resources. But the internal challenges remained just as daunting. Political divisions within Burkina Faso began to surface. While the majority of the population supported Traoré's defiance, factions within the military and government began to question the long-term strategy. The future of the revolution was no longer certain as different groups pushed for different paths forward. The question was not just about whether Burkina Faso could maintain its sovereignty but whether it could forge a unified political identity amidst the growing complexity of the struggle. The division between reformists and revolutionaries created a tense atmosphere within the government, which threatened to undermine the very unity that had driven the revolution forward. Meanwhile, the people's commitment to the cause remained unbroken. In Lomé, the protests continued, and the streets echoed with chants of unity and defiance. Citizens of Burkina Faso no longer feared the might of the West. They had seen their country reduced to poverty for far too long, while foreign powers continued to extract the wealth of the nation. The gold, oil, and minerals of Burkina Faso were no longer seen as resources to be taken. They had become a symbol of the country's newfound independence. The resources were now for the people, not for foreign exploitation. This determination became even more powerful as reports of growing unrest in neighboring nations began to trickle in. The revolution in Burkina Faso had ignited a fire across Africa. Countries in the region were beginning to follow the example set by Traoré, seeking to take control of their resources and break free from the control of foreign powers. This Pan-African movement for self-determination was gaining traction. Africa's leaders, who had long been relegated to the periphery of global politics, were now standing up and demanding that their voices be heard. For the first time in decades, the continent seemed to be united under a common cause, the reclamation of Africa's future. However, as the struggle intensified, the risks increased. Burkina Faso found itself in a precarious position. The country's fragile economy, already strained by the conflict, faced further disruptions. Foreign-backed rebel groups began to infiltrate the nation, and the risk of civil war loomed larger with each passing day. With these external threats, the question remained, could Burkina Faso endure this storm of internal and external pressures? Could the revolution maintain its momentum and stay true to its ideals of sovereignty and independence? The people of Burkina Faso knew that their fight was not just for themselves. They were fighting for the future of Africa, a future where African nations could stand tall without the interference of foreign powers. They were showing the world that Africa could no longer be a continent of exploitation. It had the potential to be a continent of self-sufficiency, unity, and strength. As the revolution reached its critical juncture, the world watched. What happened in Burkina Faso would reverberate across the continent, and the implications for global power dynamics were immense. The West had never expected a revolution like this. It had never expected Africa to fight back with such resolve. And now, as the tension in Burkina Faso reached its peak, the question was clear: would the people of Burkina Faso succeed in their quest for sovereignty, or would foreign powers crush their hopes of a free and independent future? The outcome of this revolution would shape the course of Africa's history for generations to come.